There was a time when people would meet my son Christian and say, "Oh, you're Paul Michael Raymond's son." Well, those days have long gone by. Now they meet me and they say, "Oh, you're Christian Raymond's dad." Yes, I am no longer the man, the myth, and the legend. It is now my son, thanks to Hannah. Thank you for telling me that. Yes, please sit. I encourage you fathers that wherever you go, whoever you speak to, whether you're speaking about theology or you're speaking about politics, you make sure that your sons and your daughters are watching you, with you. Because that's what Christian was. Whenever I would speak to ministers or other clergymen or politicians or supervisors, Christian was always there in my shadow. And he took to the political realm like a fish to water. And he has a strong sense of right and wrong, committed to the law word of God. And he has the fire in the belly. And that's something very rare with young men. And I do pray for all of you fathers and your sons that they too would grow to have the fire in the belly. So to advance the crown rights of Christ and to advance his kingdom authority, I give you my son, Christian Raymond.
There's a little echo before in the back, so if you have hard hearing, just raise your hand and I'll try to speak clearer in there. But for those that don't know me, my name is Christian Raymond. Obviously, I've been involved in politics in Virginia for quite some time. Way back when my dad ran for supervisor and however 20 long years ago it was, that kind of sparked my interest in local politics and state politics. And as soon as I became a voter in 2013, I jumped into party politics and campaigns. And from 2015 to just this last January, for over 6 years, 1,400 days to be exact, not that I was actually counting, I was an actual Republican Party official in a variety of capacities, from local Young Republican chairman up to regional vice chairman in the 5th Congressional District. At one point, for about 18 months, I held 3 consecutive or concurrent offices at different levels of the party. And multiple times I've held proxies to the State Central Committee at the state level in the Republican Party. So a lot of people within the party know me. Either they don't like me, they love me, they hate me, whatever it is. I do have somewhat of a name, especially within the 5th District politics. But my journey toward abolitionism started when, in 2012, during the presidential campaign, I and my sister were watching the debates and then seeing this page on Facebook called Abolish Human Abortion, looking at the memes and being like, oh, this is interesting. This is not something we heard about, this term abolition. So what is that about? And that's where the idea of immediatism started cropping up in our minds. And we kept going back and forth, seeing what the Bible said and what was being promoted by then candidate Mitt Romney and whoever. And we're like, this isn't right, something's wrong. So at that time, I volunteered for 4 days and then quit volunteering for the Romney campaign. And then started getting involved in campaigns and party politics to see what influence I could have, not just about abortion, but comprehensively about it. So I'll be talking a lot about the political aspect to this, how it is a practical solution for abolition, not what we heard earlier about incrementalism. So if you have your Bibles, open up to Luke 18. We're going to be reading the parable of the widow and the wicked judge. And this parable, it's some context. It's only given once in all of the Gospels. And there usually are sermons given with regard to eschatology, like the end times, because that's kind of how it's phrased in the context of the chapter before, but there's a lot more to it that I want to try to elaborate and show that this is, at least for me during the last couple of years, this has been the most impactful on my personal worldview, not just in regards to politics, but personal piety and the gospel message. So in Luke 18, verse 1, "And Jesus spake a parable unto them to this end, that they ought always to pray and not wax faint, saying, There was a judge in a certain city, which feared not God, neither reverenced man. And there was a widow in that city which came unto him, saying, Do me justice against my adversary. And the judge would not for a long time, but afterwards he said with himself, Though I fear not God, nor reverence man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will do her right, lest at the last she come and make me weary. And the Lord said, Hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now shall not God avenge his elect, who cry day and night unto him, yea, though he suffer long for them. I tell you, he will avenge them quickly. But when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?" And throughout all of the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, you see this theme of the widow cropping up, and it's usually paired with widows, orphans, fatherless child. And one of the reasons is because the widow, usually, I think in this scenario, Christ was alluding to an elderly widow, because in the context of the story, there's no kin, she doesn't have an attorney, she's going on her own, probably every day, or at least once a week, enough to make this guy weary, and probably seeing her far off hobbling over with her cane of, oh, there's that widow again. And so she's a vulnerable person. And throughout all of the Old Testament, you see the widow, Exodus 22, verse 22, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Deuteronomy lists the widow with the stranger, the fatherless child. So you see this throughout the law, where this is somebody that is considered destitute within the culture and cannot defend herself. So that's kind of the context of this parable, the character of the widow, where she's actually the antagonist in this story. The judge is just sitting there at the city gate. She's going to her representative, so to speak, and pleading with the judge for justice. Christ does not give context toward what she's asking to be avenged for. It could be anything. It could be maybe he was slandering her. Maybe there was a threat of violence. It doesn't say specifically, but there's enough there to give some idea as to how the structure of the parable is that the key is at the door, as the commentator said, where the purpose and intent of the parable is that, quote, they, the disciples, ought always to pray and not wax faint. The lesson of the parable is, at the end, shall not God avenge his elect who cry day and night unto him, and he says, avenge them quickly. The challenge of the parable is, when the Son of Man comes, shall he, Christ, find faith on the earth? The three characters are the unrighteous judge, the widow, and the adversary. The unrighteous judge, he is a wicked man. It is not some professing Christian. It is a wicked man. He is clearly identified as unrighteous, and there's no misrepresentation there, because it says he does not fear God, he does not reverence man, he does not obey the great commandments of love God, love your neighbor. The widow, like I said, is the real antagonist, daily possibly demanding from the judge, potentially lest she die. In one of the translations it has lest I die. And she was definitely a praying woman, because as the key at the door is how the commentator says that men ought to always pray, not wax faint. And the adversary, no detail is given about that except for the continual prolonged nature of the conflict here. Charles Spurgeon, in his sermon on this parable, expands the idea of praying without seeing by saying this quote, "A Christian should carry the weapon of all prayer like a drawn sword in his hand. We should never sheath our supplications. The soul should be not always in the exercise of prayer, but always in the energy of prayer. Not always actually praying, but always intentionally praying." So, by application, our prayers, which are our petitions to judge who is to God, who is the judge and the Heavenly Father, judge of heaven and earth, our petitions should not be used flippantly, but we should be in consistent communication with our Heavenly Father. Through our prayers, through our prayers, our faith ought to be strengthened by God alone. Now, bringing this to some practicality, in my journey in politics, I've seen firsthand how the Republican Party in particular, when they put up a bill or they lobby for something and it fails, they come back with a compromise. Or like one of my friends who's a legislative aide, he said, if you want to put up a bill, you need to already have at the onset what your compromise is going to be, because it's likely not going to pass or be heard. So you want to start with the compromise in mind and go from there. And that's kind of how, in this journey toward abolitionism that I've adopted, I'm seeing it more and more how easily it is for even somebody like me who understands the theology to quickly adopt the compromise because, we didn't win this time, let's try something different. However, using the parable, the widow never compromises her message. She never says, well, I just want justice on Tuesdays or Wednesdays. I want justice now, and I want it completely. So when preparing for this, the first question I thought was, why did Christ use a widow? Why not use an orphan? Why not a fatherless child in his parable? And that question kept coming back. I was studying, and I'm not going to answer it right away because I want to give some practical political lessons here. But that question, I think, is pertinent to the idea of prayer and the reliance on providence. So the 5 tenets of abolitionism: it's biblical and biblically engaged, it's gospel-centered, it is body-driven, it is reliant on the providence of God, and it's immediate and uncompromising. So this reliance on providence aspect, I think, is what is portrayed here in this parable, where regardless of how long it took, regardless of how receptive the hearer was, because he did not agree with her in the end, he did not change his mind, he was still a hardcore sinner, and yet he gave her justice. And I'll come back to the question of why a widow later. But I said earlier, during the beginning in 2012 and thereabouts, I got involved with live action for a little bit, and that kind of brought me into the pro-life movement, and then eventually toward campaigns and abolitionism came later. But I want to give some recent history of where the abortion debate is in Virginia since I've gotten involved on the party side. By late 2015, I was thoroughly disgusted in party politics. I almost left the Republican Party, and I was like, I looked at the Libertarian Party, and they were having their convention, and I didn't want anything to do with that because I saw how crazy that circus was. But I was still kind of debating whether to bother and stick out this journey in politics or just leave and give up and try something new. In 2016, I attended the Project Nineveh in Washington, D.C., which is street advocacy, and we went to a couple of high schools to hand out literature to the high schoolers, and Church Repent projects to hand out on Sunday to different congregations around the city. In 2017 was when I really got involved in party politics, and 2017 is kind of the year where things kind of went haywire in Virginia, and that's a lot of it. It was a governor election year, a lot of stories that I can tell you about how crazy that was, but that's kind of the year that I became a Young Republican chairman for a while, and I started getting involved in campaigns. And in Virginia, so there are 100 state delegates and 40 state senators. That year, in 2017, that's the year that Governor Northam won. He ran on a pro-Medicaid expansion platform. He wanted to expand Medicaid in Virginia. That's the state version of Obamacare, and through the budget. And a lot of the Republicans were campaigning against that. So I was supporting the Republicans. Okay, that's a good economic decision. And what happened that year, though, was the election for the House of Delegates was an actual tie. Like, there were equal number of Democrats, equal number of Republicans who won in the state House of Delegates. In Virginia Beach, I believe it was, there was a district where there had to be one or two recounts because the Republican and the Democrat had a number-to-number tie in the number of votes that they had. And this would have held in the balance which party had power in the House of Delegates, supposedly as either pro-Medicaid or anti-Medicaid. So in the Constitution of Virginia, I think, the way to split a tie is you put both names in film canisters, put them in a glass jar, special glass jar, stir them around, and either a judge or a member of the Board of Elections pulled out a name, and that's the winner. So providentially, the Republican won, and that was Delegate Yancey at the time. And so the Republicans gained the majority by one vote in the House of Delegates. That same year, though, 2017, was when the first transgender delegate in the nation was elected in Virginia, and he beat former Delegate Bob Marshall in Manassas, and Bob Marshall was one of the key advocates for anti-abortion bills and pro-marriage. He was very much involved in the marriage amendment in 2009. So you had this very big upheaval in the landscape of the culture of both parties in 2017. In 2018, though, just a few months later after Election Day, Medicaid expansion passed both the House of Delegates and the state Senate. And the reason that's super significant, Medicaid expansion funds abortifacient drugs, and it gives money to providers, so to Planned Parenthood, to clinics, to whoever, for those early term abortions. So you had, and that's chemical abortions through the abortifacients. So you had a huge amount of, it was 4 Republican senators and I think it was 13 delegates, including Yancey, who had won that tie, vote for a Medicaid expansion. And what happened in the dialogue in the abortion debate was you had some traditional conservatives focusing on the economic aspects, like, oh, Medicaid expansion is bad because of the economics. Then you had the traditional pro-lifers who said, well, Medicaid is bad because it funds Planned Parenthood. Then you had me and a few others saying Medicaid expansion is bad because it kills children through the abortifacients, which are the early term abortions that the pro-life movement is not talking about, because they're trying to advocate for the heartbeat bill and the pain-capable bills and the late-term abortion bans. They're not talking about the early-term abortion bans. So you see the nuance there of the focus within the party of where are we going with this anti-Medicaid debate. And so at the time, I was vice chair in Appomattox County for the Republican Committee, and we were, I think, the first or second to censure, like publicly condemn, all of the delegates and senators that voted for this, and then several other committees around the state followed suit. And so there was this natural, organic effort to run candidates against these delegates and senators that voted for Medicaid expansion. And so 2019 rolls around, and unfortunately, out of those 19 or 17, 19 districts, only 4 or 5 had opponents. And one of them, a gentleman that I helped, Ron Berman in Lynchburg, was the only abolitionist. So it was kind of disheartening. And we didn't win, obviously. We only got 19%, 1,100 votes. But we tried to drive that wedge issue. Medicaid expansion is bad because of this early term situation, which nobody else is talking about. And thank goodness a few of the other 4 or 5 started to listen to what we were saying and mimic some of the conversation. Of those 5 or so that ran, only one actually won. That was Delegate Scott Wyatt. He won his nomination and then won in the general. Everyone else lost. So that year, like 2017 and then the election of 2019, really has been a lot of my time within the party. And in 2019, both the House of Delegates and the state Senate went to the Democrats. So that was, and since 2019 to 2021, they just had 2 years of reign to pass everything they wanted. They're on the flip side of abolition. They don't try to compromise. They push to their antithesis and get everything through in 2 years. We can't even do it when we get a simple majority on the Republican side and stopping Medicaid expansion, for example. So during this whole 2019 was also when you heard about the post-birth abortions, the Kathy Tran bill, and the interview that Northam did. All of this is happening while we're trying to get people in that would actually support an abolition effort, and they still lose. So the lessons I learned from that campaign, that was the first time I ran a campaign, so like learning on the job is very hard. And it really changed my perspective of what the abortion debate is actually about. And that's when I think that I thoroughly got disgusted with where I was in the party, even though I still stuck with it and tried to do what I can to push an abolition message. In the past couple of years, you've seen another upheaval. I think God has given, not the Republican Party, I'm not saying that God's in favor of them, but they've been given another chance with this governor election last year to fix, I guess would be a word I would use, the mistakes of the past. And what I've seen since 2021 is they don't even want to talk about abortion. Governor Youngkin said on the campaign trail that he doesn't really want to deal with the issue. He's going to focus on economics, focus on schools. It was actually Students for Life that did a rally against that. They did it at one time, I think, and got blowback for that. But ever since he's been elected, that really has been off the table in the entire dialogue. However, there's been rumblings of dissatisfaction with where things are within the pro-life movement. Just this session in February, a bill for a pain-capable ban, so 20-week ban, was introduced by Delegate Freitas, I think. And when a bill is introduced, it gets submitted to a subcommittee or some committee, usually if it's an abortion one, it usually goes to courts of justice or one of the healthcare committees. And so this pain-capable bill was presented, and the Delegate Rob Bell, who is the chairman of the Courts of Justice Committee on the House, didn't even have a hearing. Like, this is their pinnacle bill that other pro-life states have passed, and yet he, as a pro-life Republican who was part of the Tea Party movement in 2013, I think, refuses to even hear it. And he says, we don't currently see a path for that bill to pass both bodies and to reach the governor. And unfortunately, you had the president of Virginia Society for Human Life, Olivia Turner. That Society for Human Life is the Virginia Right to Life chapter. She responded, this is all in public record, Virginia Mercury in February. She says, quote, one has to be realistic. The Senate is an obstacle, of course, for any legitimate, substantial pro-life legislation. We have another year to wait, 2023, before some changes occur in the Senate. And one hopes we will see a more pro-life Senate. So the Senate in Virginia is controlled by the Democrats by one vote. So she's saying, and Rob Bell is saying, we don't even want to discuss this until after the election in 2023, which actually means January 2024 when session starts. So that's a whole year and a half before they even start a discussion on their own incremental bills. So fast forward to when this Roe v. Wade decision leak happened, we started talking about having a conference a little before then. But Olivia Turner continues, she wrote an op-ed, and she says, quote, among some pro-life groups, the news is leading some to a premature celebration that may mean more questions once the final ruling is made. The fact of the matter is that the removal of Roe v. Wade, as important as it is, does not automatically make abortion illegal. I agree. Like we heard that before. I agree. It just sends it back to the states. Simply overturning Roe v. Wade would mean for many states, including Virginia, quote, a very long, complicated road to passing effective pro-life laws that could, doesn't say shall or should, that could protect unborn children and their mothers from the abortion industry. And then in another op-ed she writes, quote, punishing the mothers who have abortions if Roe is overturned would be tragically wrong and would ignore the role that the fathers, the parents, and others play in pressuring some women to get abortions. So what you're seeing in Virginia, and this is nationally as well, mostly from the Right to Life organization, but also from the Republican Party, they're already prepping their argument for a prolonged debate on abortion after Roe is overturned. Right now, it's we can't pass an abolition bill because Roe is the law of the land and we can't do anything about that. But they're now saying, they're going back to their old playbook. We don't have the votes for that anymore. We got to wait till after the next election to get the votes. And maybe, possibly, probably not, we'll pass something that could maybe help a child and the mother. So that's where it is right now in Virginia. And it's really aggravating because these are the people that are professing Christ. They go to church every week. Some of them have been elected for years, and they're doing the same playbook which we've seen of just kicking the can down the road. Abortion is just a social issue, and we don't want to deal with it because we don't have the votes yet. So while being involved in the Republican Party, you are taught Every election is the most critical election in your lifetime. And don't think about future elections, think about this one, because we got to win this one to get the votes this time. And that just keeps happening every single year. And that's why, prior to last year, the party hasn't won anything statewide in over a decade. So they have no future vision other than winning this election. And so contrast all of that to this parable, going back full circle here. Some specific applications of the parable to political activism. There are 4 M's. There's the message, the method, the motivation, and the movement. The message is, do me justice against my adversary. There's no caveat, there's no mincing of words. It's do me justice now, immediately, completely against my adversary. Doesn't matter what the context is, doesn't matter who the adversary is, doesn't matter who I am. Justice needs to happen, and it has to happen now. The adversary obviously berated the widow for a long time, and this is just a persistent thing in her life, and she wants justice now. The method, the widow in that city, which came unto the judge for a long time. The widow went in person to the judge of her city, her representative, to call for justice face to face. She could have written letters, she could have sent somebody in her place. If she was in today's world, she could have posted on Facebook or done a blog or something, but she didn't. She went in person to the civil magistrate. And in my own experience, up front and close to like letters to the editor I've done, and it's gotten me in trouble a few times, but in person, face to face is always the most effective, especially when you weren't on their schedule to begin with and they don't really want to talk to you, and you just try to get your way into the office in Richmond or wherever to have that face-to-face interaction, maybe while they're in the bathroom or en route to the lunch hall. You say, hey, I want to just talk to you real quick, 2 seconds, just want to talk about this bill or whatever the issue is. This parable also doesn't say how frequently the widow went. I think it was probably every day. It just sounds like this is just continual, not harassment, but continual pleading. And then point number 3, the motivation. This is the hard one. This is the one that I had to really struggle with, because there are two parts to it. One is the motivation of the widow. She wants justice. That's simple. Now, the motivation of the judge. He says that he's giving justice because this widow troubleth me. And for me, that says, regardless of whether, putting myself in the widow's shoes, I want justice from my representative. It doesn't matter if they're a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter if they're pro-life or pro-choice. I want justice from them, and I want it now. And it doesn't matter if I convince them that my cause is just. So it doesn't matter, you as a Virginia voter or wherever you live, it doesn't matter if your representative is Republican or Democrat or a socialist, as there used to be in Virginia. You have an obligation to go before them regardless and say the same message continually over and over and over again until they either are voted out of office or they give you justice because they're tired of hearing your message. And bringing it to an even personal level, you need to examine yourself about, are you in this fight for the right reasons? What is motivating you to seek justice? Are you doing it because of self-interest, or do you have a repentant heart? Are you trying to get them to have a repentant heart as well? And then later on in the parable it says, shall he, Christ, find faith in the earth? Do you lack faith in your request? Do you actually believe Christ will suffer along with you, like as a joint partner in your suffering in this battle to achieve justice? What is your faith what is motivating you to act and to lobby for this legislation, or are you doing it because some lobbyist told you to, or some pro-life group is donating to your campaign or helping you door knock or whatever it is? And then point 4, the movement. I kind of already said this, yea, he suffered long for them. Christ is suffering with us in this battle. Not against us, but with us. And are you ready to suffer long with Christ and for Christ? Is your fight in this abolition movement towards Christ's glory or political gain? That was my hard thing. I wanted to go up. I could have ran. I don't live in Virginia anymore. I live in Wisconsin, unfortunately. But before I moved, I could have ran for another seat and gotten it handily. I was already asking people, should I run for it was a district position. And I had a lot of support. I could have run and win, but I didn't. So if I had run, I don't think I would be here today because I'd be too busy. Today actually would have been a meeting in the Republican Party for that position, so I wouldn't have physically been here. Do you have the patience to submit to God's timing? And that's another thing. The verse about some plant, some water, some pull the weeds. If I can just be a seed planter and a weed puller, that'd be great. But maybe I'm just a waterer. And that's where the body-driven aspect of abolitionism comes into play. This conference is not because of one person or even all the speakers. There was a whole team. I didn't even know there was that much food going to be prepared. There's a lot of pieces to this puzzle that is beyond one person. You cannot abolish abortion or accomplish anything through your own strength. It is a body-driven battle. And so where do we even begin with this? Like, the significance of this conference, even though there are only 4 speeches and there's a lot of, I love seeing all these kids here because it shows the future battle is already being prepared. And this is a long process in the spiritual sense, even though we want justice and we want it now. But we're also creating a dividing line in this debate. Who is on the Lord's side? Because it's not just about saving babies. It's about biblical justice and equal protection completely and immediately according to God's method for political action and legislative action, not the incrementalism that we have currently going on. Understand, and again, where do we begin? One of the things that really shocked me into reality was reading the Code of Virginia, especially the abortion section, because it is so integrated in and throughout the code. You have all these tentacles in the code, and really trying to pin down how to abolish abortion through the code. You need to understand the code to do it, and thankfully, like I have it here, we're going to post it online, the bill that we're going to get a sponsor for. But usually what the pro-life movement advocates do is they nibble around the edges. They deal with the tentacles. They don't kill the animal. And so, for example, the pain-capable bill. Well, they feel pain at 20 weeks or wherever. Let's deal with that instead of saying, let's abolish abortion so that obviously they won't have pain because there's no more abortions. Or the heartbeat bill, as was mentioned earlier, like Christ did not have a heartbeat when John the Baptist leapt in the womb for joy. So why are we putting more significance on if they don't have a heartbeat, or if they do have a heartbeat compared to if they don't have a heartbeat? Just end abortion, and it doesn't matter if they do or don't have a heartbeat. So the tentacles within the code is really the only thing that's been attacked, instead of dealing with the actual heart of the matter. So when we publish this bill, when I get to my laptop later tonight, I'll put it on the website. It amends parts of the criminal section of the code which essentially give mothers, fathers, and abortionists, I'm using the phrase qualified immunity in the abortion process. The code says, it is essentially, the entire code is pro-life with the exceptions. It is saying you cannot murder a fetus in the womb, in the abortion section of the code, it actually identifies the fetus as an unborn child, quote, unborn child, twice. Personhood is already established according to the Code of Virginia, but it gives an exception saying only those licensed professionals can do abortions. So it is already saying we recognize this child as a human child, the mother's child, and yet we're allowing the abortionist and anyone else to participate in this activity. So I see the time is coming close, but I want to just return to very briefly to this idea, why a widow, and why does that matter? Throughout the scripture, like I said earlier, the widow is used repeatedly as one of the characters or one of the vulnerable people that need protection by the law. And the thing that I found most interesting was in 1 Kings 17, Elijah ministered to a widow and then saves the widow's son from death through prayer. Christ refers to this event in Luke 4, this is prior to this parable, and then performs an even greater miracle, quote, near the gate of the city. And that's where he saw a widow's son being carried off because he was dead. And Christ commands the son. He doesn't need to pray. He gives a word to the son to raise from the dead. And the crowd later, Luke 9, when the transfiguration happened, the disciples said, some say you're Elijah or one of the prophets. So the people that saw that miracle with the widow's son being raised from the dead remembered the story of Elijah and said, this must be Elijah, come back from the dead, because he just raised a widow's son. So bringing it to the lesson of prayer, are you suffering along with Christ in this battle because of some sense of personal piety or moral obligation? Or do you actually believe that the Christ you're suffering with can raise a dead person alive again and accomplish this justice, in this case for abolishing abortion? Like, do you actually have the faith of this widow, or are you doing it for a personal obligation? And that's the question that I've been struggling with, because it's easy to get wrapped up in the politics and want to win this election. And I would advocate with any of my colleagues that are watching, like, you need to identify what the actual goal is, which is ending abortion, not defeating these tentacles, and really examine your tactics that you're using, because it's insufficient and cowardly to just deal with the surrounding incremental legislation. My last thought, which I apologize for my somewhat scattered brain speech here, but another story of the widow. Christ was also pointing forward to, in Acts 9, when the Hellenistic widows, the Greek widows, were not given an equal share of the bread, and the apostles gave justice to them by giving them equal treatment, essentially, in the congregation. So just to summarize the whole lesson of the parable is the reliance on the sovereignty of God and the providence of God in all things. Do not lean on your own wisdom or earthly tactics to fight abortion in this political battle. Go to your legislators continually. Don't change your message, and don't advocate your responsibility to these other organizations, because as we saw, they're already compromised. They've already set the stage for post-Roe, saying, we're already going to prolong this because there's another election to win. And in Virginia, every year is another election year. So fear not and glorify God, because he suffers along with us through the battle. And that's what I will close with. the final thing, though, this emblem is somewhat significant because it's the cardinal, which is the state bird, holding the state flower, which is the dogwood flower. The cardinal represents us, the abolitionists, covered in the blood of Christ. We are one of the most aggressive birds in Virginia. If you have a bird feeder, you know this. And we want to go at them. We want to fight and get all the seed. We don't want some of the seed. We want all the seed. And it's holding a dogwood flower, which has those 4 points, which have clips in them. And in a dogwood, when it blooms, each point has like a pinkish reddish hue on it. And the lore behind a dogwood flower is it represents the cross of Christ, where each of the 4 corners represents the pierced hands and feet. So we're the aggressive cardinal holding the gospel of Christ, and we're flying through an upside down pyramid, which is the world being turned upside down, the pyramid of the enemies of the gospel being turned upside down, because that message is the only thing that will save them to turn it right side up again. So that's the symbol that we're running with. And once we find, which I think we're close to finding a sponsor for the Abolition of Abortion in Virginia Act, this will be posted on the website within the next 24 hours. There's a lot of legal jargon in it, but it is as clear and short as possible. It is only 7 pages long, and some of that has to do with definitions, but I will end, and thank you for your time.